And then Kenny, is it possible for you to
Yeah.
record this locally
Yeah.
on yours
Let
also?
me, you just started recording, so I can't record. It says
Oh,
it's
okay.
recording.
Okay. Well, okay.
So I think you've
That's
got
fine.
it.
Well, just checking when this is.
I'm gonna grab the water real quick.
Cool. Well, I guess we could probably get going here. So I just have a quick spiel. My name is Jack. I'm the host for this session. Let's see. So it should be about 20 minutes of presentation, 20 minutes of questions. I will be monitoring the chat for both questions and comments. So just please keep it respectful. What else? Let's see. If you do have any issues with anything, I can help you with those. Questions, either type them in the chat or use the raise your hand button at the bottom of the screen. Don't type anything or use the Q&A button. And I'll just leave it to you now, Kenny.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Jack. And thank you for the good luck on the side comments. I always appreciate that at the start of a presentation. I might go, by the way, spoiler alert, this might be more than 20 minutes of talking. But please leave your questions. We'll get to them at the end, and then I'll be available to chat afterward as well. You can hit me up on social media or in a group chat. But let's dive into it, since I mentioned I'll probably go long. And one quick other thing is I am on the tail end of having COVID, so apologies if I'm a little today, but I'll power through it for you. So this is a story that I think is pretty timely in light of yesterday's news. That's the Supreme Court has struck down Roe v. Wade, because this is ultimately a story about how one woman, in a time when women had no power, had no vote, had few rights, she said her voice was going to be heard. And she wrote a series of letters to the president that changed history. This is a story of empowerment, about the difference that one person can make when the rest of the nation has given up hope and all seems lost. That woman's name is Julia Sand. And I want you to remember that name, because we're not going to come back to her for a while. But when we do, she's going to change everything. So let's back up to the start, a good place to begin. This story takes place during the Gilded Age, an era of unchecked American capitalism. Business was booming, but only the wealthy really benefited. The poor were toiling in factories, they slept in slums. It wasn't a good time. In Washington, D.C., there was only really one party in town, the GOP, the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln and the Union. The Democrats, they'd been the party of slavery and the Confederacy. And now that's obviously not what the parties are today. It was what they were back then. And in the 44 years following the Civil War, the GOP's record in presidential elections was 9-2. They controlled everything. And so controlling the GOP was the only game that mattered. And in that game, there were two men who towered above the rest, James G. Blaine and Roscoe Conkling, aka the Magnetic Man and Lord Roscoe. James G. Blaine was one of the most charismatic men to ever pass through Washington, D.C. He was a popular Maine congressman, a 3-time Speaker of the House. He was so slick that his nicknames included the Magnetic Man and the Plumed Knight. He could tell you no, and you'd somehow like him more than you did before he told you no. His followers were known as the half-breeds, and they represented a moderate wing of the Republican Party. Think 19th century rhinos. Roscoe Conkling was a different sort of cat. Brilliant, vain, arrogant, pompous. He walked around carrying a pistol. He was a boxer, probably the only person in Congress who worked out back then. He had a Superman curl on his forehead, and he openly slept with the wives of his colleagues. When an editor once told Conkling he was going to publish proof of one of Conkling's affairs, Conkling stone cold said, then I'll have to kill you. And the publisher believed it, and he didn't print the story. Conkling was just that kind of guy who could piss on your leg and tell you it's raining. But Lord Roscoe's powers didn't come from his arrogance or his oratory. It came from the New York City Customs House. Back in the Gilded Age, the American government wasn't funded the same way it was today. There was no income tax. Instead, the government was almost completely funded through tariffs on overseas trade. And something like 70 to 90% of all tariffs were collected by the New York City Customs House. And as a senior senator from New York, Conkling was in position to name who the collector of that customs house should be. And Roscoe milked that for every penny it was worth. Think of it, 90% of the country's international trade all passing through one port, and you control the guy in charge? That was a gold mine waiting to be exploited. There were, of course, the legal fees the port levied on ships that came through, tariffs, docking privileges, so on and so forth. All of that, a share of it, went to Conkling's pocket. But then there were also the illegal fees the port collected. Say you pull up to the port with a ship full of goods. The port might say, hey, it's going to take a while to process all your cargo. How about we put it in that warehouse over there so you can get it off the deck? And you say, sure. They put it in the warehouse, and then 25% of it disappears. And then you start seeing employees of the port selling it on the street corner. Like, that's the kind of age, the kind of era we were talking about. And all that money, that went to the stalwart war chest that Conkling used to bribe or elect politicians. There was a saying back in the Gilded Age. An honest politician was a bought politician who stayed bought. And Conkling wanted to use all those bought politicians to become president. And Blaine wanted to use his charisma to become president. And it didn't take too long for these two men to realize they hated each other's guts. Back in the 1860s, when Conkling and Blaine were a pair of up-and-comer congressmen, Blaine verbally attacked the vain Lord Roscoe's peculiar way of walking and talking on the floor of Congress, mocking his, quote, turkey gobbler strut. And Conkling hated it. And they were pretty much arch enemies from that day forth, which is going to lead us to the election of 1876. In 1876, President Ulysses S. Grant, the famed Union general who had led the country the previous 8 years, was stepping down. So Blaine, Conkling, and seemingly every other Republican in the country was running for office to take his place. There were no primaries back then, so all the action happened at the National Convention, where delegates would vote round after round until a clear winner emerged. At first, Blaine took the lead, but I don't think he anticipated the potency of Conkling's spite. When Lord Roscoe saw Conkling was in the lead and threatening to want to run away with it, he threw his support behind an Ohio governor / let's be honest, nobody named Rutherford B. Hayes. Not because he wanted Hayes to win or like the guy, but more because he wanted Blaine to lose. It's the same strategy my siblings take against me in every board game we play. They don't have to win, I just have to lose. And in 1876, Blaine lost, Conkling lost, and Hayes won. But that started to backfire on on Conkling, when Hayes used the power of the presidency to dig into Conkling's corrupt political machine. Remember what I said about the Gilded Age being super corrupt and just a terrible time to not be rich? Well, politicians, they still didn't give a crap about the poor, but Conkling's machine had started to squeeze the wrong rich people, and it was catching the attention of Congress, where those rich people had friends. In 1874, Conkling's Customs House, led by a professional stooge named Chester Arthur, write that name down, told a prestigious global shipping company that it owed the port $200,000 in unpaid fees, which was, and that's a lot of money now. That was a lot of money back then. The firm, they wrote the check and they did an audit. How did we overlook all this money? And what they found is they actually owed less than $2,000. They'd just been shaken down by Conkling's machine in the port. And so that's about when they called their friends in Congress and Hayes, and Hayes and Congress put a target on Conkling's back and started trying to take him down. In September 1887, Hayes asked Arthur, the port commissioner, to resign his job at the Customs House so Hayes could appoint New York philanthropist Theodore Roosevelt to clean house. And I know what you're thinking. Hey, Theodore Roosevelt. No, not that Theodore Roosevelt. This is Theodore Roosevelt Sr. You're thinking of Theodore Roosevelt Jr., father and son. Roosevelt Sr. was as good and honest a man as you can find in New York City, which means he was scary as hell to Roscoe Conkling. So Conkling ordered Arthur to dig in and put up a fight. Over the next several months, Conkling and Hayes duked it out in Congress, where they used all their power of persuasion, called in all their favors to try to win control of this customs house. Roosevelt Sr., he kind of got caught in the middle. He was not a political animal, and he started to wear down and get sick. In December of 1877, Roosevelt Sr.'s nomination was officially defeated 31-25 in the Senate. 3 months later, Roosevelt, his health failed him. He died of stomach cancer, dying just before his son Theodore Roosevelt could get home from college to see him. You know how Batman became Batman because someone shot his parents in the alleyway? Sometimes I feel like Teddy Roosevelt became Teddy Roosevelt because he felt like Conkling's machine has killed his father. But it's time for Roosevelt to leave the narrative. We're done talking about him. We're still in 1878. Hayes is still trying to get Arthur out of the customs house. Conkling is still blocking him, but eventually Congress does have to recess. So when it takes a break and everybody leaves DC, that's when Hayes uses presidential powers to replace him in a recess appointment. Now, Conkling was annoyed, but he was about to get a chance to set things right because the 1880 presidential election was coming up and Hayes was stepping down. And Conkling had an ace up his sleeve. Ulysses S. Grant was coming out of retirement to run for a third term, and Conkling was going to be Grant's campaign manager on the convention floor. Grant was a massive celebrity and hugely popular. He was also the president who had allowed Conkling to first get his tentacles into the customs house, and he was likely to do so again if elected. Sure, Conkling wasn't going to be president himself, but if Grant won the customs house, and probably a sweet spot in the cabinet would be Conkling's. The presidency could come later. But Conkling's cockiness was about to get the better of him. When he tried to rig the rules of the 1880 GOP convention to make sure that Grant won, another Ohio nobody, Congressman James Garfield, he stood up and gave a speech in protest. And it rallied the delegates against Conkling. It defeated Conkling's proposal. As Garfield stepped off the lectern, a livid Conkling handed him a note that said, quote, "New York requests that Ohio's real candidate and dark horse come forward." I don't know if this was serious, but Conkling was about to find out how right his note was. But first it was nomination time. Lord Roscoe leapt up onto the press table and roared to the crowd, "When asked what state our nominee hails from, our sole reply shall be, he hails from Appomattox." He was talking about Grant. The crowd went crazy. They were eating it up. Conkling said that Grant was a man who had, quote, "never been defeated in war or peace." And Conkling gave a ripping speech that people thought would have won the nomination for Grant right there if the ballots had been taken. But the ballots weren't taken yet. Instead, Roscoe sat down, and then that guy Garfield stood up to nominate some other guy. But Garfield's nomination speech didn't exactly go as planned. Midway through his speech, when he rhetorically asked, "What do we want?" somebody in the crowd yelled back, "We want Garfield!" And everybody cheered, and Garfield was probably a little embarrassed, but he went on and nominated the other guy. And then the balloting began. For the first 33 ballots that lasted over 2 days, Grant held a narrow lead over Blaine, but couldn't quite punch through. But then on the 34th ballot, 16 delegates switched to Garfield, who wasn't even a candidate. And then on the 35th ballot, 50 delegates swung to Garfield, who was now doing his best to remind everybody, dudes, I am not a candidate. And that's when James G. Blaine, who was communicating with his floor manager via telegram, he saw an opportunity not unlike Conkling's 4 years earlier. The convention was getting away from Blaine. It was clear he couldn't win, but he could block Conkling's man Grant from winning. And according to my siblings, sometimes making your rival lose is all that matters. So that's what he did. Blaine threw his support behind Garfield. Garfield won the nomination on the 36th ballot, and Grant and Conkling were defeated as much by Conkling's arrogance and hubris as anything else. But then something unexpected happened. Republican Party elders were afraid of a loss in November if they didn't have Conkling's support behind the ticket. So in an effort to win him over, they approached his favorite lieutenant, Chester Arthur, and asked if Arthur wanted to be vice president. And Arthur was like, "Who, me? You talking to someone? Me? I mean, he'd never been elected to anything." Didn't they know that he had been fired from his only political position, New York Port Commissioner, because of his rampant corruption? But now they wanted him to be vice president? All right, then, he said yes. When Arthur told Conkling, Lord Roscoe blew his top. You should drop it as you would a red-hot shoe from a forge. He didn't want compromise. He wanted to fight. But maybe for the first time in his life, Arthur stood up to him. The office of the vice president is a greater honor than I ever dreamed of attaining, he said. In a calmer moment, you will look at this differently. And boy, would he prove right. That fall, Garfield won the presidency and Arthur the vice presidency. Then, when Garfield was putting together his cabinet, Conkling and Arthur tried to twist Garfield's arms into getting what they wanted. Forget the New York Customs House, that was small fries now. Conkling wanted control of the US Treasury. Imagine what Lord Roscoe could do if he controlled the Treasury. But Garfield wasn't playing ball. Even worse, Garfield nominated James G. Blaine as his Secretary of State, an absolute insufferable outcome for Conkling. Conkling sent Arthur, the vice president, to lean on cabinet nominees and encourage them to quit Garfield's administration if Conkling didn't get his way. And then Arthur, Vice President Arthur, went to the press and said, quote, Garfield has not been square, nor honorable, nor truthful with Conkling. Garfield was so hurt and offended, he banned his vice president from entering the White House. But he refused to budge on the cabinet nominations. He wrote to Blaine asking how Conkling and his stalwarts could be stopped. Blaine wrote back that the stalwarts, quote, must not be knocked down with bludgeons. They must have their throats cut with a feather. Which, coming from a guy known as the Plumed Knight, is just delicious. In the end, Conkling provided the feather. In an attempt to show how powerful he was, he shocked the Senate by announcing his resignation, confident the New York State Assembly would re-elect him and send him back to D.C. in a vote of confidence that Garfield wouldn't be able to ignore. But the New York State Assembly did not re-elect Conkling. It didn't elect anybody. It got bogged down in factionalism, and Conkling appeared frozen out, which looked like good game, Garfield victory. With Conkling out of the Senate, Garfield and Blaine would have a much easier time ending the spoil system that had empowered his stalwarts through civil service reform. They would get on it as soon as Garfield got back from a well-earned vacation. But then, tragedy struck. Blaine and Garfield were walking to the train station together for Garfield to take the rail out of town for some rest and relaxation, when a man emerged from the restrooms behind him, drew a pistol, and aimed it at Garfield's back. Bam! Bam! Garfield was shot in the back. He collapsed to the floor as the station erupted in chaos. An officer grabbed the assassin, who proclaimed, I did it. I will go to jail for it. I am a stalwart, and Arthur will be president. Whoa! Garfield's death was slow and painful. Doctors, ignoring the latest science on antisepsis, probed his wounds with dirty fingers, introducing bacteria that became an infection that killed him. The assassin, a lunatic named Charles Guiteau, was a disgruntled office seeker. He'd given a single speech on Garfield's behalf and had become convinced that Garfield owed him a diplomatic assignment in Paris in return. And when that didn't happen, because of course that's not going to happen, Guiteau became convinced that God wanted him to murder Garfield in revenge. But Guiteau had been right about one thing. As Garfield lay dying, Chester Arthur, the mutton chop stooge of Roscoe Conkling, was about to become president, and the nation was freaking out. Convinced it was about to descend in an era of unprecedented corruption, where every loyalty was for sale, and the riches of the government were exploited by Conkling and his goons. But then, before Garfield had even slipped away, Arthur received an unexpected letter. It read, "The hours of Garfield's life are numbered. Before this meets your eye, you may be president. The people are bowed in grief, but do you realize it? Not so much because he is dying, as because you are his successor. Your kindest opponents will say, Arthur will try to do right, adding gloomily, he won't succeed though. Making a man president cannot change him. But making a man president can change him. You cannot slink back into obscurity, if you would. 100 years hence, schoolboys will recite your name and a list of presidents and tell of your administrations. And what shall posterity say? It is for you to choose. The author was an invalid New York woman named Julia Sand. Had Julia ever met Arthur? No. Was she someone of means or influence? No. She was just a citizen with a pen, a paper, and a mind, and a belief that Arthur could change. And then, even crazier, Arthur began to change. A few weeks after Garfield's death, Conkling gave his lieutenant a visit and demanded Arthur make Conkling Secretary of State. Take that, Blaine! But Arthur said no. And Conkling lost it. Conkling roared at Arthur. He called Arthur a traitor, and probably much worse. But Arthur refused to budge, later saying, "For the vice presidency, I was indebted to Mr. Conkling. But for the presidency of the United States, my debt is to the Almighty." And at the encouragement of Julia Sand, Arthur continued to buck Conkling. In fact, he did more than buck his own boss. He actively pushed for legislation to undo Conkling's empire. In 1883, Arthur signed the first major civil service reform bill in American history. It introduced competitive exams, promotions based on merit, and a ban on forcing employees to contribute money or time to political causes, which had been the gears of Conkling's machine. This is the foundational law in creating a bureaucracy that works for the people instead of politicians. Whenever someone becomes president and they talk about wiping away the deep state so they can do whatever they want, this is the stuff that stops them from doing that. This is the stuff that defends our democracy. Conkling would never again play a major role on the national scene. He died in 1888 after ignoring everyone's advice by attempting to walk through a great blizzard and contracting pneumonia. If you visit New York City's Madison Square Park, you can find Lord Roscoe's statue standing there, looking down on you in disdain. James G. Blaine would continue to seek and fail to attain the presidency. As it turned out, he was basically as corrupt as Conkling, just in pursuit of profit instead of power. His scandals would cost him the White House in 1884, and he later died in 1893. Years later, in 1937, a grandson of Chester Arthur inherited the former president's surviving papers. As he looked through them, he found a special envelope tied with a ribbon that contained 23 letters written by a woman no one had ever heard of. The woman was Julia Sand. The grandson put out newspaper ads trying to find the mysterious woman, and a nephew of Julia Sand reached out. The nephew told Arthur's grandson that he knew about Arthur and Julia's correspondence because the nephew had been at Julia's house one day in 1882 when President Chester Arthur unexpectedly visited to meet the mysterious woman who had been writing all those letters. As far as we know, it's the only time they ever met, and the only time Arthur ever contacted Julia. There is no record of Arthur ever writing back. The nephew revealed that Julia had lived to be 83 years old before dying in 1933. Few ever knew that she'd once been the secret advisor of a president, and that she'd once inspired a corrupt man to go straight and save American democracy. That's the presentation. I hope y'all enjoyed it.
Thanks, Kenny.
Let's see. Do you run the show from here? Or?
I mean, we both can. What the heck?
Cool.
Somebody commented, let's see, Kevin commented, great story. Thanks. Just one comment. I have had this chant struck in my mind for years. And it goes, Blaine, James G. Blaine, the confidential liar from the state of Maine.
Yeah,
continental
liar. You know, you're not just that's a big thing, a continent. You're a continental liar. Blaine, James G. Blaine, the continental liar from the state of Maine. I actually This is from that 1884 election. What Blaine had done is he had pocketed money from railroads to give them rights to expand. A lot of congressmen were doing this in the Gilded Age because the railroads were so booming, and quite a few of these scandals ended up coming out and destroying a lot of careers. In Blaine's case, it didn't destroy his career, but it did block him from becoming the presidency. His opponents would taunt, Blaine, James G. Blaine, continental liar from the state of Maine. I once had a colleague actually named Kevin, and I asked him, I was like, "Hey, has anybody ever thrown at you at the playground growing up?" And he was like, "No." And I was like, "Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Nobody would know that." Let's see. I'll read through these questions. Thank you, J.E. Moon, on the compliment. I think it's such a fascinating story. That story of Blaine, Roscoe, Arthur, Julia Sand. It's such an interesting era too, because I feel like this is really like one slice of a bigger story that's happening here, and that's like, think about it. In 1865, the Civil War ends, Lincoln is shot, and the GOP is in power, and the GOP is sitting there, and it's like, what do we stand for? We were formed to oppose slavery, but slavery's gone now. What does the GOP stand for now? And, in the decades that followed, Grant tried to make it about like civil rights, liberties, protecting the freedmen. But that eventually fell out as the story of corruption, took over instead. And is the GOP going to be a party of machine politics? And later you get to McKinley and it becomes a party of big business, So there's this really interesting story of this evolution of, in a very quick succession, you lose Lincoln, you lose the head of your party, you lose the first Republican president, you lose your issue, you lose slavery. What do you stand for? And this is a chapter from that story that I think is really fascinating.
We do have a couple questions here.
Yeah.
Alicia asks, did your research uncover what prompted her to write, I think she meant write to
the president. Yeah, it's right, the president. Yeah. Absolutely, Alicia. My understanding is it's kind of tied to, I forget if I mentioned this, but Julia Sand was an invalid. No one's sure what disease or illness she had, but she was frequently, for long periods of time, restrained to the couch. Like she couldn't get up, she couldn't go around, she couldn't live like an active life. And so because she was restrained in this way, she read a lot of news. She was a voracious follower of politics and the news. And I think that following of all this stuff is what inspired her to know the issues, know what's going on, have an opinion. And then it was just the right amount of gumption to say, like, you know what? I'm going to write this person. I'm going to write this person a letter. I'm going to tell them what I think. And not a, you suck, you're terrible, go to hell letter, but I believe you can change letter, and she continued like 23 letters. Like she gave some advice on everything was through his president. For example, during his administration, Congress will force through a Chinese Exclusion Act. One of the first limitations on immigration in American history, a really shameful thing. And she urges him like veto that, and he at first vetoes it. And then they pass like a veto-proof majority, so he decides to sign it because he doesn't want to be overruled by this veto-proof majority. And she's like, "I'm disappointed in you." She holds no punches. Which, how often as a president do you have somebody who will tell you when you're wrong? So I think that's kind of where this inspiration comes from.
J.E. asked, did Chester B. Arthur do anything else of note in his administration?
That's a good question. This is the most famous thing he's known for, is the civil service reform, also the Chinese Exclusion Act, because that while that wasn't his policy, he didn't want to do that. He did eventually sign it, feeling that he was being overwhelmed by the political moment, and that begins this long legacy that personally I'm not a fan of limiting immigration to the United States. It didn't exist before then. Before then anybody could come. Welcome, everybody. Come on over. You get a ticket on a boat, hop on over. He also, though, he would catch a disease late in his presidency too, Bright's disease, which would basically turn him into an invalid too. And so the last years of his presidency, he wasn't able to accomplish much, and it contributed to him not running for re-election.
Let's see. Katrina asks, who is that in the cover photo / painting for this session?
I didn't pick that cover photo painting, so I'm actually not sure. I saw that for the first time when I was like looking for my thing, and I was like, I don't know, it looks like John Adams. Let's see, let me pull it up. Yeah, maybe this will be a quiz for the organizers of Intelligence. Do you know, Jack? Do you happen to know where that
Let me see. I didn't take a good look.
If anybody in okay, here's now the trivia game. If anybody in the audience recognizes that person and wants to share, you, I mean, I have no prize, but you win a prize, and the prize is like my undying respect, which my dog says is worth a lot. So
yeah, now I'm not seeing it, but here I'll
yeah,
Oh, now I don't know who that is.
yeah, I don't know.
Eric says it's interesting that Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, and Cleveland all served single terms. Cleveland would come back in 92 to serve a second non-consecutive term, but why so many one terms in a row?
That's a really good question. I I think there's a lot of people who, when they become president, find it's not what they thought it would be.
No Air Force One at that point.
Yeah, it's a harder job. You get a lot of grief. You can't accomplish everything you want to accomplish, and so they get burned out, and they just start being like, "Oh, give it to someone else." I'm actually right now in my podcast. I always like to be well ahead in my reading and my writing, so I'm currently reading and studying on Harry Truman. And when Harry Truman becomes president, he's like, "Ah, man, I don't want to be president. This job's gonna suck. Like, can somebody else do this? Oh, here, Eisenhower wants to be president. Sure, he can be president. Like, it's not always what it cracks up to be. So I think that's maybe a part of it. Some of these people also just lost. Cleveland ran for re-election and he lost. Arthur stepped down because he was sick. Garfield was shot. Not his choice. And Hayes also entered the presidency under a big cloud of scandal. I didn't get into this, but his was one of the most controversial elections in American history, where there were actual contested slates of electors. Because down in the South, you had white supremacists blocking and murdering and using terror to prevent the black vote. And so when people started looking into these Southern electors, and there's still Reconstruction happening at that time, they found that, whoa, this Southern vote is not what it looks like. And so you started getting multiple things of electors, this real question of who is president, who should be president. And Hayes wins that presidency against the Democrats out of this really weird kind of committee that forms. Like it was beyond the Constitution. You were beyond the rule book. There were no rules written for what happens in this situation. So the Senate was like, let's make a committee of like senators and congressmen and Supreme Court justices, and they'll decide which electors to accept. And then the Democrats tried to basically bribe one of the Supreme Court justices by offering him like a senator seat if they would do what they wanted. So he took the Senate seat and didn't participate in the commission, and that resulted in a different Supreme Court justice who ruled in the Republicans' favor. It's very complicated, very fascinating. Recommend checking out my episode on Rutherford B. Hayes to learn all about it. But yeah, this period of history is wild.
Alicia asked, do you know if her correspondence was ever published for the public? This is such a fascinating story. Well told.
Yeah, I have certainly found some of her letters. I don't know if they're all available, but I guess they would all be. I believe the Library of Congress has them available. Like just Google Julia Sand letter, and you'll find them. And you'll read the first one. I didn't read it verbatim because there's more. There is more about like, dude, people are freaking out because you suck. Please change.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
Actually, Kenny. So you mentioned those Chinese exclusion acts. So along with some of those like anti-Chinese laws that came about in like the late 19th century, one of them included that like the parents of Chinese workers that died on the railroads could not sue for wrongful death.
Wow.
And those were not those laws have only like very recently, especially in the state of Washington, been contested because a girl I went to high school with, she was driving, she left her home to go get coffee with a friend in my hometown, and she was approaching one of those large tour buses, and apparently the guy, like the person driving it, had some kind of stroke, and the bus veered into oncoming traffic and hit her car and killed her. In fact, when you drive on that road, you can still see in the hedge where the like a visible indent of where the vehicles were. It turned out that her parents could not sue the company for wrongful death, despite the fact that this is the Chinese, these laws didn't just affect Chinese people. This is a white family. They couldn't sue because of these laws.
That's insane. There were a lot of terrible laws written. And the sad thing about terrible laws, about racist laws, is they inspire racist acts. When the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed, for example, that's not all that happened. A bunch of communities in the West were like, oh, cool, let's kill the Asians around here. And you had several massacres, you had several murders after that act was signed because they felt that Congress had their back to be horrible, racist sons of bitches. So it's always a very tragic thing when any of these laws happen, when a big thing like that happens, because it's always more than the law. You know, it's more than just that thing. It's what's that message say, and then what do people do?
Yeah. We have 4 minutes left if we have any other questions.
Yeah.
Or raised hands.
It looks like we got an answer on the Google image person, James Wilkinson, who died in 1825.
What are you working on now, Kenny?
Good question. So right now I'm polishing up my script on Woodrow Wilson. He's the next president coming up. That episode will be out early in July. And then I'm rescheduling all my interviews about Woodrow Wilson because catching COVID kind of blew all that up. So hopefully there's not like a big gap in the production of episodes. But working on Woodrow Wilson, getting some interviews. The interesting thing to me about Wilson's time is there's so much huge stuff that happened that he had nothing to do with. And I'm a little bit at a loss of like, how do I address that? You know, like during his time, 4 constitutional amendments passed, which is crazy. You know, there's like, I think 20 something total. To have 4 during one administration. The first one allows an income tax to happen. There's prohibition. That's huge. He had nothing to do with that. Women's right to vote. He had nothing to do with that. These are huge things. These are seismic things. So I am trying to think, how do I cover that stuff?
Nice. Do you have a favorite president, good or bad?
I think my favorite is John Quincy Adams so far. Not for anything he did as a president. He sucked as a president. He failed as a president. He was a one-term president. He did absolutely nothing. But after he left the presidency, his hometown was like, hey, you should be our congressman. And he was like, only if nobody will run against me. And they're like, we'll promise nobody will run against you. And he got elected. And he found this fantastic second act as a congressman who is vocal in the fight against slavery. So vocal that Southerners passed a gag rule saying he couldn't say the word slavery anymore because they were pissed at how effectively he was fighting them. And he has the most epic death too of they're just doing like a roll call vote on the Mexican-American War, which he considered a war to expand slavery. And as they're like, who wants to thank the generals? He's like, no, because he hates the war so much. And they're like, all right, fine. And they call the roll, and he stands up when his name is called, and he lurches to the side. And they're like, oh my God, John Quincy Adams is dying. And he gets like taken to the speaker's chamber, and he dies there in the Capitol building. And his last words are like, I've reached the end of the world, and I am composed, which is pretty cool, epic last words. But the main thing, the thing I really love about this is you expect the presidency to be the peak of the guy's career. And it's not. The peak of his career comes after he failed at being president. And so there's such a beautiful lesson in perseverance and failure and rebounding from what seems like a crushing failure. There's always more you can do. So I love that president.
Oh, and then bad. Real quick, because we got 1 minute.
Favorite bad president?
Yes.
Oh, I'll say Tyler. Just he's the one coming to mind. Just because he's so fascinating. He gets burned in effigy. Okay, so John Tyler becomes president because William Henry Harrison dies 31 days into office. John Tyler does not believe in his political party. He opposes all its things. The party burns him in effigy, kicks him out, and he is like so desperate to hold on to power that he annexes Texas. Basically because he thinks it's an issue that will divide the other parties and get him reelected. And that starts like the dominoes to civil war. So he is like the guy I circle on, like, we don't talk a lot about him, but villainous. Oh, and he has a grandson who's still alive, which is crazy. A man who was president in 1843 has a grandson who's alive right now. That's wild. So cool.
Thanks, Kenny.
Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye.